The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 is generally thought of as being largely bloodless, the peaceful collapse of a superpower. This idea of a bloodless collapse is a false myth, however, perpetuated by the fact that a Balkan-style series of wars did not erupt as they did during the collapse of Yugoslavia. But it doesn't take much digging to realize that more than one war broke out in several of the newly independent republics, and even within the Russian Federation itself. I'm your host David, and today we are going to begin an investigation into the factors that allowed for the civil war that broke out in Georgia, the effects of which can still be seen in the headlines even today. This is the Cold War. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the newly independent state of Georgia descended into civil war as Abkhazia and South Ossetia asserted their own claims to independence. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika had unleashed decades of underlying nationalist resentments across the USSR, and Georgia was no exception. The war there lasted until December 1993, claimed approximately 20,000 lives, and displaced as many as 260,000 people. To this day, Abkhazia and South Ossetia remain disputed territories, with no end to the disagreements in sight. But while the patchwork of Soviet Socialist republics, autonomous Soviet Socialist republics, and autonomous oblasts the Soviets had created in the 1920s was bound to cause problems at some point, why were they so acute in Georgia? Okay, as you probably already know, the Caucasus, the region that today comprises of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and parts of southern Russia, is a mountainous region located between Europe and Asia. Though we could create an entirely separate YouTube channel trying to unpack the long, rich, and complicated history of this region, to keep things brief, the Caucasus is home to around 50 different ethnic groups. In part, this is because the difficult and often isolating terrain of the Caucasus dictated that many groups developed their own distinct ethnic, linguistic, and cultural traits. Among them are, of course, the Georgians, Armenians, and Azeris, but also smaller groups such as the Circassians, Chechens, Ingushetians, Dagestanis, Mingrelians, Abkhazians, Ossetians, and Ajarians, just to name a handful. Now, let's take this and throw empire into the mix. Before the Soviet period, various parts of the Caucasus repeatedly changed their allegiances between the Mongols, Persians, Ottomans, Russians, and others. This led some groups to pick up different religions and cultural traits, but also to the frequent movement and displacement of peoples. Given these factors, it's not hard to see how the age of nationalism at the turn of the 20th century created problems in the Caucasus. How could ethnic groups with tiny populations, who in many cases were distributed across areas no larger than a few valleys, form their own functioning states? Did the ethnic groups who claimed ownership of territory have a historic right to do so? And could these groups coexist in larger states with neighbors with whom they oftentimes had little in common, and oftentimes could not even understand? Such questions were difficult to answer back then, and remain difficult to answer now, but nevertheless, one emerging force, and the men who led it, were hubristic enough to believe that they had the answers: the Bolsheviks. Okay, so in a previous video on the Georgian SSR, we explained that Georgia had been incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1921 while under Russian occupation with the help of local communists. We then explained that Georgia had joined the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, or SFSR, in 1922 before becoming its own constituent republic in 1936. Though these developments are true, like many aspects of Soviet history, the reality is a lot more complicated. In fact, the territory that was administered as the Georgian SSR included the Socialist Soviet Republic of Abkhazia, the South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast, and the Ajarian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. Though all three types of administrative unit came with varying degrees of freedoms and constraints, for the purposes of this video, the point is that the republic was split administratively into 4 pieces. And why exactly was this the case? Well, the endogenous historical factors we already discussed played a big role, but the Soviets' attitude towards nationalism was equally vital. Indeed, leaders of the Bolshevik movement, like Lenin and Stalin, theorized that nationalism was an inevitable consequence of history and capitalism, and that to build the USSR they needed to overcome it. Thus, they pursued a policy of Korenizatsiya, meaning nativization or indigenization, depending on how it's translated. In essence, Karadeniz aimed to defeat the destabilizing threat of nationalism by forcing ethnic groups in the USSR to gain strong national identities at a vigorous pace. In so doing, the Soviets believed that they could force people to get over their nationalist sentiments quickly and later replace them with class consciousness necessary for an enthusiastic belief in communism. Thus, under Karadeniz, the Soviets tried to create a reliable pool of cadres in every corner of the USSR by promoting their respective languages and cultures to a position of primacy over those of Russia. While there was of course a gaping lacuna between theory and practice, granting autonomy to regions like Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Ajara was an integral part of the Karadeniz process. In Georgia, the three administrative enclaves for Abkhazians, Ossetians, and Adjarians meant that Karadeniz had highly divisive effects over the long term. Initially, like other minority languages in the USSR, Georgian was promoted, but when Stalin scaled back Karadeniz from the 1930s, Georgians faced a fight to protect their language as Moscow tried to make Russian the sole lingua franca between different ethnic groups across the empire. Still, as we highlighted in our previous video on the Georgian SSR, Georgians were quite successful in protecting their language and culture. Nationalist protests following the removal of a statue of Stalin and Khrushchev's secret speech, for example, saw Moscow informally grant Georgia an unparalleled degree of national expression to avoid further unrest. Though it was not until 1978 that the Georgian language and alphabet were officially protected by the Soviet constitution, in practice, Moscow exercised a laissez-faire approach for most of the 60s and 70s. The result was therefore a hierarchical language system in the Georgian SSR. Georgian took primacy, then Russian, and only then did the ethnic language of an ASSR or autonomous oblast have any real purchase. It was therefore perhaps Georgia's relatively unique position within the USSR that made it so easy for ethnic minorities in Georgia to direct their anger towards Tbilisi rather than Moscow as the Soviet Union began to pull apart during the 1980s. With this context in mind, we can now turn to the Georgian SSR's three separate administrative regions themselves, starting with Abkhazia. On March 31st, 1921, the SSR Abkhazia was established. Until December 16, 1921, so only 9 months, Abkhazia was completely independent, but then signed a treaty that incorporated it into the Georgian SSR. In the immediate century prior to Soviet rule, Abkhazia had mostly been a part of the Russian Empire. It was seized in parts between 1829 and 1842, though full control was only established in 1864 when its local princely authority was abolished. As a result of the Russian conquest in the 19th century, many Abkhazians were expelled or left to lands elsewhere in the Russian and Ottoman empires. In terms of demographics, it's generally estimated that Abkhazians constituted around 53% of the territory's population at the turn of the 20th century. A Russian-led agricultural census in 1917 later found that Abkhaz people accounted for 30.4% of the population in rural regions, while ethnic Georgians accounted for 41.7%. The corresponding figure for urban regions is unknown. It is clear, however, that many Abkhazians were forced to flee in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and that many Georgians, Russians, Armenians, and Greeks subsequently settled there. A particularly interesting case is that of the Afro-Abkhazians, a group who settled in the Ajubja region. To this day, nobody really knows how they appeared. Some theories suggest that they're the descendants of slaves imported in the 17th century during Ottoman rule, while others suggest that they arrived under the rule of Peter the Great. In any case, by 1917, the majority of the Afro-Abkhazians spoke only Abkhaz. Relatedly, it's important to note here that Abkhaz and Georgian are not mutually intelligible and derive from completely separate language families. The leader of Abkhazia in 1922 was a Bolshevik named Nestor Lakoba, a good friend of Stalin's. Notwithstanding Karadeniz and Lakoba's relationship with the Vozhd, it became clear quite quickly that Abkhazia's autonomy would in reality be pretty limited. In 1921, the chairman of the Revolutionary Committee of Abkhazia, Efram Eshba, sent a letter to the Caucasian Bureau of the Communist Party's Central Committee, which secured Abkhazia's status as an SSR rather than an ASSR. By the end of the decade, however, Eshba was deemed a threat and executed. Though Lakoba never challenged Abkhazia's administrative status thereafter, he still did what he could to maintain Abkhazia's autonomy. According to historian George Hewitt, Lakoba, quote, in every way possible resisted the introduction of collectivization, having stated that in Abkhazia there was no kulak class and that all estates were equal. This, of course, did not impress Moscow. Hewitt continues, quote, "He did not carry out many of the party directives, for which in 1929 he was subjected to strong criticism by Stalin." During this period, Stalin had also become increasingly skeptical of Korenizatsiya. Nevzat Torun and Karadeniz Arastirmalari explained that the Soviet nationality policy designed to foster native culture slowly and essentially came to a halt in 1934. Stalin found the level of indigenization and minority nationalism occurring in non-Russian nationalities to be problematic, as he believed that it would be a threat to the effective implementation of his far-reaching economic policies. The case of Abkhazia fits this theory quite well. In 1931, Stalin agreed not to impose collectivization on Abkhazia, but only on the condition that Lakoba would join the Georgian SSR as a downgraded ASSR. Lakoba had little choice but to accept. For his troubles, he was poisoned and killed by Lavrenti Beria on a trip to Tbilisi in December 1936. With Lakoba out of the way, Stalin pressed ahead with collectivization and forcibly transferred tens of thousands of Georgian peasants into Abkhazia in the late 1930s. As we mentioned, this was accompanied by the scaling back of Korenizatsiya, which saw Russian and Georgian culture and language promoted at the expense of their Abkhaz equivalents in a process that scholars such as Hewitt and Anastasia Shesterinina called Georgianization. In 1938, Stalin's terror had reached Abkhazia, and by 1952, over 80% of Abkhazia's nomenclatura consisted of native Georgians. Hewitt describes this as amounting to the total liquidation of the political and intellectual elite of the Abkhazian people. These documents are absolutely crucial for understanding the animosity between Georgians and Abkhazians. In short, the forced assimilation consolidated a collective Abkhaz historical memory that they had been oppressed by two ethnic Georgians in the form of Stalin and Beria. Nevertheless, from the 1940s onwards, relations between Abkhazians and Georgians were generally amicable in the public sphere. According to Shesterinina, ties between Abkhaz, Georgians, and other groups in Abkhazia were strong in neighborhoods, organizations, and families. The principle of neighbors' solidarity was extended not only to the ethnic Abkhaz, but also to those who were resettled to rural areas of Abkhazia. Furthermore, the Georgian Abkhaz Mixed Families Union in Tbilisi reported that 40% of families in pre-1991 Abkhazia were mixed. The reality was, though, that most Abkhazians were not happy of the nature of their coexistence with Georgians. Both groups generally avoided the so-called Abkhaz questions in everyday conversation, for example, and many Abkhazians refused to attend Georgian schools. Such everyday acts of resistance became much more common following Stalin's death in 1953. In 1957, for instance, the Georgian journal Mnatobi published an article which denied the territorial roots of the Abkhaz, prompting both large protests in Sukhumi and members of the intelligentsia to complain to Moscow. The movement to protect Abkhaz culture became more organized still in 1967 when the Letter of Eight was addressed directly to Leonid Brezhnev, sent by leading members of the Abkhaz intelligentsia after a consultation with around 5,000 citizens in Sukhumi. This was followed in 1977 by the Letter of 130, which included the line, quote, "At present, the situation that has developed in Abkhazia requires radical measures for its resolution." All the signatories of the document were repressed or arrested, which again incensed Abkhazians and led to the spontaneous destruction of Georgian language road signs in the ASSR. Though Abkhazia did receive some concessions from Brezhnev soon after, including the recognition of Abkhaz as a national language in its 1978 constitution, the rise of Georgian nationalism in the 1980s provoked only more animosity and the creation of the Ajara Abkhaz nationalist movement. Perhaps the final straw was the drafting of a state program for the Georgian language in November 1988 in Tbilisi, which outlined that teaching in all the Republic schools, including in the autonomous regions, would be in Georgian, and that acceptance into institutions of higher education would hinge on a test on Georgian literature and language. The proposal was ratified into law in August 1989. The bottom line is therefore that the seeds of conflict in Abkhazia had already been sown by Stalin and Beria. Gorbachev's reforms simply exposed the shoots that had been slowly but surely growing in the shadows for decades. To demonstrate the lack of real integration, even by 1985, just 1.4% of Abkhazians spoke Georgian, and only 0.3% of Georgians living in Abkhazia spoke Abkhaz. As summarized by Shesterinina, the reduction of the newly acquired political status in the first Soviet decade, the inability to settle in urban areas, especially in central Abkhazia, and the integration of Georgian and other groups in and around Abkhaz villages, repression of the Abkhaz elite and population, loss of the native language and cultural institutions, and the myths surrounding the origins of the Abkhaz on the territory that they felt strong belonging to, meant the gradual dissolution of the Abkhaz identity in the dominant Georgian population. Okay, so that was the situation in Abkhazia. Next, we turn to the South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast. From 1774, Ossetia was part of the Russian Empire, but in 1918, a conflict between Bolshevik-backed Ossetians and Menshevik Georgian aristocrats erupted over the legal ownership of land in South Ossetia. Tskhinvali, the South Ossetian capital, played host to uprisings in 1918, 1919, and most significantly 1920, during which around 40 Ossetian villages were destroyed, 5,000 people were killed, and anywhere from 20 to 35,000 Ossetians were forced to flee to neighboring North Ossetia in Russia. The South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast was thus created in Georgia on April 20th, 1922, as a reward for the Ossetians' loyalty to the Bolsheviks during the Russian invasion of Georgia in 1921. North Ossetia, meanwhile, became an autonomous oblast of Russia in 1924. This was predictably followed by Ossetian calls for unification. According to Terry Martin, Stalin initially agreed, but later changed his mind, as he feared that following through would result in further demands for autonomy from other ethnic groups in the region who found themselves part of the Russian SFSR. For this reason, to this day, South Ossetia is internationally recognized as part of Georgia and North Ossetia as part of Russia. Though reliable statistics for South Ossetia's demography during the early 20th century are hard to come by, in 1989, ethnic Ossetians made up about 66% of the total population, and Georgians constituted approximately 29%. The nature of everyday life in South Ossetia during the Soviet period is certainly under-researched, but the information available suggests that the Ossetians shared the Abkhazians' resentment towards Georgianization, at least initially. The scholar Stylianos Sotiriou explains that during this period it never ceased to represent a separate minority. Consider such an identity-critical element as language. The Ossetians' Eastern Iranian language was not compatible with Georgian. As of 1988, 86% of Ossetians could not communicate in Georgian. Unlike Abkhazia, however, South Ossetia did not desire independence. Rather, they wanted to reunite with North Ossetia, and this was not necessarily considered Georgia's fault alone. There was, therefore, much less animosity between Ossetians and Georgians, and perhaps what one might even call good relations. Stephen Jones argues, for example, that for the next 68 years under Soviet rule, Georgians and South Ossetians lived and worked together, intermarried, and traded together. Before the 1990s, many more South Ossetians lived in Georgia's provinces than in the South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast, 99,000 out of a total 164,000, which attests to their mobility and a sign of their growing integration into Georgian society. Before the autumn of 1989, it was unimaginable that Georgians and South Ossetians would go to war. So, what happened? Well, what Ossetia did have in common with Abkhazia was a sense that the increasingly intense Georgian nationalist movement unleashed by Gorbachev was a threat to their language and culture. Therefore, in the late 1980s, the Ossetian popular nationalist group emerged called Ademon Nikhaz, meaning popular shrine. According to Sotiriou, Ossetians were by this point riding the tide of nationalism that was spreading across Soviet territory. South Ossetia, he continues, denounced what it perceived as a Georgianization policy that was targeted against the Ossetian identity. Further, it awakened the old demand for a dismantling of Stalin-era federal structures, which had artificially divided Ossetia into North and South, in order to facilitate the unification of the two regions. When comparing the two cases of Ossetia and Abkhazia, it's therefore clear that despite better relations between the Ossetians and Georgians, the perceptions of their ethnic groups' respective plights eventually coalesced around very similar issues. And now finally, this brings us to the Adjaran Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. Located in the southwest of Georgia on the border with Turkey, Ajara developed somewhat separately from the rest of Georgia, owing in part to the Lihi mountain range, which splits the country in half. Ajara was part of the Ottoman Empire during the 16th and 17th centuries, and this had a significant effect on the population. By the end of the 18th century, most Ajarians had converted to Islam, away from Christianity, the traditional religion of Georgia. In 1878, however, Ajara was ceded to the Russian Empire, which prompted both an influx of Christians from elsewhere in Georgia and an outflow of many Muslim Ajarians to Turkey. From 1918 to 1920, and immediately before Soviet rule, Ajara was temporarily occupied by British and Turkish troops before being fully incorporated into the Democratic Republic of Georgia on July 20, 1920. When the Red Army invaded Georgia in February 1921, Ajara was then granted autonomy under the Georgian constitution owing to its large Muslim population. This did not last long though. In March 1921, Turkey re-invaded Ajara. Though the Turks were defeated by the Georgians, the two sides signed the Treaty of Kars in October 1921, which enshrined Ajara's autonomy within Georgia once more. Surprisingly, when Georgia became a constituent republic of the USSR, the Soviets continued to honor this. As a result, this made the Ajarian ASSR the only autonomous oblast or republic in the entire Soviet Union that was based solely on religion. However, due to Korenizatsia's emphasis on language as the basis of national identity, in addition to these severe attacks on religious activity throughout the Soviet period, Ajara did not really develop its own sense of national identity, nor was it characterized by a pervasive sense of distinct or historic nationhood. The Ajarian language itself was also very similar to Georgian, and though it had developed as a distinct dialect, it was similar enough that Ajarians and other Georgian minorities could understand each other with relative ease. In the 1926 Soviet census, Ajarians were listed as a separate ethnicity, but by the time of the 1939 census, they were counted as Georgians. Ajara would play its own role in the Georgian Civil War as the Soviet Union collapsed in the late 1980s, though this will be explored in more detail in part 2 of this series. So, what does all of this mean? Well, in summary, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Ajara all had somewhat divergent experiences under Soviet rule in terms of their relations with both Moscow and with Tbilisi. Given that they all had different administrative statuses, this makes sense. But when push came to shove, the Abkhazians and Ossetians, in particular, their grievances were directed primarily at Tbilisi and at Georgians due to the unusual primacy of their native language and culture over those of Russia in the Georgian SSR. This of course brings us back to the Georgian perspective. Georgia had also been part of the Russian Empire before the Soviet period, and notwithstanding Moscow's lighter touch approach after Stalin's death, Georgia was just as much a victim of Russian and then Soviet colonization as any other ethnic or national group in the USSR. Certainly, under Soviet rule, Georgians experienced the same attempts to suppress their language and culture as anyone else, and to that end, their fight to express their national identity and gain independence was also just as legitimate as anyone else's. The de facto and eventually de jure protection of Georgian language and culture had not been an accident. It was the result of a hard-fought battle. The only reason we have not covered it in much detail here is because we will delve further into this in part 2 of the series. But by looking more closely at Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and to a lesser extent Ajara, we see that the contentious questions of self-determination that beset the ethnic groups of the Georgian SSR in the late 1980s were fundamentally symptoms of the same disease: colonialism. And who was to blame for that colonialism? Well, as we've shown today, that's a matter of perspective. In any case, the legitimacy of one side's territorial claims over the other is not really the point of this analysis. Rather, the point is that Korenizatsiya and broader Soviet rule in the region did not make any of the complications of the Caucasus demography go away. Instead, they simply froze them or even intensified them, leaving Georgia and its various peoples in what was essentially an impossible situation when the Soviet Union collapsed. It was largely for these reasons that Georgia found itself on the precipice of the confrontation that would eventually lead to civil war in 1991. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which has been divided into 2 halves, each with declared loyalty to a different YouTube channel. this is gonna get messy. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.